In this video, we're going to expose why Utah's elections keep turning blue. It's because there is a machine that by design takes red elections and turns them blue. And the key ingredient this machine runs on is money. It is coin-operated, and the Utah Republican Party convention nominee for the governor race, Phil Lyman, is challenging this machine that corrupts elections, altering outcomes contrary to the will of the people. Phil has filed a petition to the United States Supreme Court to stop this machine. We're going to go over some of the many highlights in his petition and unpack them in a way that I hope is relatable to everyone. The link to this petition is in the description. There are some really great observations that every Utahn and every American should know. I hope you don't miss them. They're far from common knowledge, but they do much to explain why our election outcomes aren't as fair as they should be, especially at the local level. I'm also going to identify something that could make this case even stronger and restore election integrity back to George Washington levels that I think everyone has missed when discussing this problem, because it goes way beyond Utah's SB 54, the signature gathering bill that is being challenged. In fact, I'm hopeful that Phil Lyman will go bigger than he has on this issue by helping us get rid of the red to blue machine completely. The part he is challenging is the coin slot on the machine, as it were. But there are other triggers and control mechanisms still exposed to the government that could change election outcomes contrary to the will of the people, even if SB 54 were repealed. The fact that such a machine even exists and was installed by the government is the bigger issue he should go after. He has standing to do so, and so do we all. The problem boils down to what the ballot looks like. Phil Lyman was the Republican Party's nominee for the governor race in Utah in 2024. Someone in the government pressed a button and a trapdoor opened, swallowing Phil Lyman, the people's candidate, while a government-sponsored candidate emerged from the shadows to take his place, masquerading as the grassroots Republican nominee. As a result, Phil Lyman did not even appear on the general election ballot, while Spencer Cox, who lost the Republican nominating convention to Phil Lyman, was on the ballot, with the Republican Party's endorsement next to his name. How did this happen? We'll explain how as we unpack this petition. This petition was filed after Spencer Cox had ousted Phil Lyman from the general election ballot and after Phil Lyman had appealed the matter up to the Utah Supreme Court, which refused to grant his petition for relief. I'm not going to go into the procedural history of the case. I'm going to review its content, and there are several very juicy quotes in here from the Supreme Court itself, and others I hope you will remember. This petition relies extensively on something referred to as the right of association, or the freedom of association. However, there is an additional, more powerful right that should also be invoked if this case proceeds to oral argument. So without further ado, let's jump right in. All right, so here is Phil Lyman's petition to the Supreme Court of the United States. Spencer Cox is the respondent, along with others, and I just love this. I'm just going to read this to you. The question presented. It says, in New York State Board of Elections versus Lopez-Torres, this court held, quote, a political party has a First Amendment right to limit its membership as it wishes and to choose a candidate selection process that will, in its view, produce the nominee who best represents its political platform. These rights are circumscribed, however, when the state gives the party a role in the election process, as New York has done here by giving certain parties the right to have their candidates appear with party endorsement on the general election ballot. Close quote. As in Torres, the Utah Republican Party's associational rights are at issue only as a shield and not as a sword. No Utah law prohibits a candidate from attending a political party convention and seeking to persuade the delegates to support him. Did the Utah Supreme Court run afoul of this court's judgment of Torres by concluding that a state can mandate a candidate who won the political party's nomination through the convention process to participate in the direct primary because the candidate who lost at convention collected signatures, giving the losing candidate a second chance to seek the political party's nomination? So that is the question that has been presented to the United States Supreme Court for their consideration. And what's at stake here is that the Republican Party of Utah has defined its own internal nominating process, and that is the caucus convention system. The convention is the nominating convention, and what happens with caucus and convention is that voters go to a neighborhood meeting called a caucus, and they vote for delegates, and then those delegates go and represent them at the nominating convention, and then they go and vote for whomever they want to represent them. And this is known as an indirect election method, as contrasted with a direct election. A direct election is like the primary, where everyone just shows up and you just vote, or like the general election. Everyone shows up and you just directly vote for the candidate that you want to represent you. And so the problem here, and why I said that this machine turns red votes blue, is because the party, the members of the party, have chosen to use this indirect electoral system, which is more of a Republican type of a system. And so that's why I call it red. There's this other system, the direct Democratic primary, which has been glued onto the Republican caucus convention. And by having a mechanism to overrule the nominee, the candidate chosen by the people through the indirect electoral method, the Republican method, they're able to transmogrify these red votes into blue votes. Because even when you have the same citizens who are invited to participate, the same voter base, essentially, the same party, invited to participate in both of these election methods, a different subset of the people will tend to participate in each method, and the outcome is also inherently different. This is a theme we're going to see repeatedly throughout this. An indirect election tends to produce more Republican candidates, right? Whereas a direct election tends to produce more Democratic ones. And so what the state has done is they have forced this direct Democratic primary, and they have been doing this for a long time. It actually precedes the signature gathering bill, SB 54, that's being challenged here, by a long, long time, close to 100 years, actually. So that's one of the reasons why I say there are actually some additional measures that we can take, and some further understanding that we need of how this machine operates, so that we can successfully prevent the problem of, Republican candidates becoming increasingly blue shifted, as it were. The rights that are being argued at the core of this petition are referred to as associational rights. That is, refers to the freedom of individual members of a political party to associate with whichever candidates they want, and to refuse to associate with candidates that they do not want, right? And so that's the language here is largely associational, although what I would like to point out here is that the stronger rights involved are actually representational rights. People would not care nearly as much what the opinion of Republican Party leadership is about a certain candidate, or what the Republican Party endorsement was, if the party itself were not regarded as having some kind of unique representative power. And that's actually something that we really need to have hawk eyes for as we go through this petition. Because that is the key to unraveling the damage that's been done over the course of nearly a century in Utah and more than 2 centuries in the entirety of the United States on that point, with usurpation of political power. So please hang in there, and we will cover that topic and expose what those rights are and how they function. But essentially, the argument here is that associational rights are being violated anytime the will of the party itself and the people who comprise it are violated, right? And that's a very good argument, because that's exactly what's happening here. It is common in arguments such as these to anthropomorphize political parties, and you see that right here in the highlighted text here from the Supreme Court language, saying that a political party has a First Amendment right to limit its membership, yada, yada. As an abstraction, this is useful because organizations are made up of people, and it does not make sense to say that just because a group of people have gathered together that they no longer have rights or something like that, or because you joined this tennis club or whatever, that you forfeited some of your representational rights or something. That does not make sense at all. The useful abstraction here is to think of a political party as though it were a person, because the rights of the party, or any organization, by the way, any organization, any collection of people, will always be exactly equal to the rights of the people who make up that organization. An organization does not have more rights than individual people. It does not have fewer rights. As long as we're talking about private organizations that do not have any special dispensation of power from the people themselves under the Constitution, that will always be the case. So, but we are going to, what I would recommend you do here is every time you see political party or party, think about a person. Think about yourself. Think about any other person. Think about, is this fair to do to a person? And if it's not fair to do to a person, then it's not fair to do it to a political party, okay? All right, so I'm just going to skip past a lot of the boilerplate text here. There is an introduction here. It's very brief. I'm just going to read it. It says, "It is beyond debate that freedom to engage in association for the advancement of beliefs and ideas is an inseparable aspect of the liberty assured by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which embraces freedom of speech. Petitioner Phil Lyman, hereinafter Petitioner Lyman, was chosen as the nominee by the Utah Republican Party delegates at the nominating convention held on April 27, 2024, by receiving more than 60% of the votes." That part in quote is from the party rules. Petitioner Lyman received 67.54%, 2,495 delegate votes. Yet a direct primary was held on June 25th, 2024, between Petitioner Lyman and respondent Spencer Cox and respondent Deidre Henderson for the office and joint ticket of governor and lieutenant governor. Respondent Henderson has certified that she and respondent Cox are the Republican Party nominee. So Deidre Henderson, the lieutenant governor candidate on the Spencer Cox ticket, actually oversaw this election and certified the election, certified herself as the Republican Party nominee, which is a conflict of interest if there ever was one. Petitioner Lyman petitioned the Utah Supreme Court for extraordinary writ, wherein a single justice determined that he has not presented a basis for the court to exercise its discretion to grant the relief requested, denying his petition for extraordinary relief. Not recognizing the entire ruling from this court and only quoting a portion of the above-named court case, New York State Board of Elections versus Lopez Torres, construing it to fit a narrative that the state can force Petitioner Lyman to a direct primary after he had already achieved the party nomination at convention. So again, those are those two parts of the machine, the partisan nomination process, the caucus convention, and then the state is forcing a direct primary, the more democratic method, turning those red votes blue. This court has often noted constitutional rights would be of little value if they could be indirectly denied. Petitioner Lyman respectfully petitions this court for a writ of certiorari to review the judgment of the Utah Supreme Court, the court of last resort, and remand the case back for further proceedings. And there's some additional opinions and jurisdictional statement, no expected rehearing, etc., constitutional statute and provisions. Statement of the case, you are welcome to read this and just get up to speed about what happened here. I'm not going to read it in the current case because I want to talk more about the principles involved and where this could go in the future. Okay, scroll down to this section, reasons for granting the petition. Petitioner Lyman recognizes that a writ of certiorari is not a matter of right, but an exercise of judicial discretion granted under compelling circumstances. There is a little footnote here that I would add, anyway, that the Judiciary Act of, 1925, I think, actually changed that to where it used to be regarded more as a matter of right to be able to appeal a contest up to the Supreme Court. But then they decided that they wanted to reduce their caseload, etc., some other arguments. And so the present day perspective on it is it's not regarded as a matter of right, even though it originally was viewed much more so as a matter of right. He says, what could be more compelling than forcing a candidate to face an additional challenge after already receiving their party's nomination? This is a very compelling question. This predicament exists solely because the respondents could not secure their own nomination at the convention. Lyman's situation is not merely inconvenient, it is a profound injustice that calls for this court's supervisory intervention. This is a very, very good point. Okay, so forcing a candidate who has been nominated through the convention process under yada yada, section 20A9407, to seek nomination again by a direct primary turns the First Amendment on its head. The Utah Supreme Court's ruling was both dismissive and unjust, ignoring First Amendment rights that protect a party from excessive state interference in party affairs. In this previous case, Utah Republican Party versus Cox, Chief Justice Timkovich's dissenting opinion rings true that Utah's 2014 election law reforms, that refers to SB 54, or the signature gathering nominating petition route that Spencer Cox and also John Curtis used to get onto the ballot, says purposely try to change the substantive type of candidate the party nominates. This is big, right? All while masquerading as a mere procedural reform. If true, such a project would severely burden the party's associational rights. And without compelling justifications, it would be unconstitutional. This nominating procedure has significant repercussions, interfering with the Utah Republican Party's internal processes, altering the types of nominees produced, and providing unwanted candidates a way to veto the party's nomination. And that's a very good way to put it. That somebody who can just come in as an outsider, essentially, with a very small minority, it's only about 1.6% of registered voters who would need to sign one of these petitions and just overrule whatever the convention delegates wanted as their nominee, as well as the people who elected those convention delegates, which is a sizably much higher percentage of the registered voter population, right? And so there's this tiny minority who has this back door, is able to trump the kind of candidate and say, "Whoop, nope, we're getting a different kind of candidate," right? We don't want a Republican one, we want a Democratic one. That's essentially what they're doing, okay? So SB 54 substitutes the Utah legislature's judgment for that of the party as to the desirability of a particular internal party structure. The law is, in effect, a sort of state-created majority veto over the candidates a party selects through its carefully crafted convention process. The Utah Republican Party's internal nominee selection process has impacted the political party's ability to define itself. Candidates can evade the scrutiny of delegates chosen at the party's caucus, ignoring the caucus system altogether. This is true. It like nullifies their vote, right? The new procedures reshape the party from a close-knit community that thoughtfully selects candidates to a more loosely connected assembly of individuals who simply cast their votes on a Tuesday in June. So again, that's contrasting the indirect election method, where it's very rigorous. The delegates get a lot of access to the candidates. They'll have the candidates will hold tons of meet and greet events, and they'll go and the delegates will just go and grill them. They get tons of access to these candidates, and so they can vet them very thoroughly. Whereas the vast majority of the populace, I've gone and been to, I've lost count by now, but I think it's maybe almost 12, around the neighborhood of 12 delegate events as a state delegate with John Curtis, and I got to ask him quite a few questions. It was very, very revealing, the kind of interactions you can't ordinarily get through a more direct election process. So, again, that's just contrasting the methods. SB 54 has altered the types of candidates nominated by the party, which was the goal of its advocate, Count My Vote. This is true. You can go and read the Count My Vote initiative that was filed with the Lieutenant Governor's office, and they very bluntly state that it was their intent to change the kinds of candidates elected. A nomination process that relies on convention delegates will yield different candidates compared to one that involves a broader audience, which has included many individuals with only a nominal affiliation of the party. Count My Vote recognized this dynamic, as did the party itself. The new signature gathering method for nominations has led to more moderate candidates. Again, so you start with Republican candidates, you blue shift them through this, second stage of the process that the government can trigger basically at will. And, anytime there's a candidate, the government's like, oh, that candidate's too conservative, or for whatever reason, they don't like that candidate, they just push a button and trigger the second stage, basically. And that shifts the candidates towards the blue end of the spectrum, right? So to more moderate candidates, as Count My Vote intended. Yeah, and you can read their position statements on that. This process has produced nominees and nominee positions other than those the party would choose if left to its own devices. So again, this is a place where I would suggest you put the term person in the place of party. So we the people, not just the parties, but we the people, factually got a different candidate than the one we intended in office. This is big. This is, if you will, a method of stealing elections, frankly, because the intent of the people was to get a Republican nominee, and we didn't get a Republican. We got a moderate, right, if you wanted to use the euphemism, but frankly, somebody who was supposed to have been more on the red end of the spectrum, but came up more blue, right? So, big deal. The law violates the right not to associate with an unwanted candidate, a corollary of its right to associate. In no area is the political association's right to exclude more important than in the process of selecting its nominee. And again, I would just call your attention to the fact that, if the political party did not wield actual political power above and beyond that of the people themselves, this would be a non-issue. Because if you didn't like the Republican Party's nominee, you just take a step back and you disavow and you say, well, I don't like that candidate. You just don't vote for him, right? But it gets more complex than that, right? Because again, as I mentioned earlier, this process determines who even shows up on the ballot, right? Yet under this regime, a person who collects signatures can be named the party's nominee in spite of the fact that they lost at the party's nominating convention. This system enables nominal members, or even those opposed to the party's policies, to potentially take control of the party's platform if an individual can gather enough signatures, whether through fame or wealth, So this is where pay-to-play comes in. They can challenge the candidate chosen by the party at convention in a primary election. I mentioned pay-to-play because signature gathering is primarily a money-driven process. If you have good name recognition, or if you just have a lot of money, it's not that hard to just go find the more concentrated zones where people are likely to recognize your name, and Spencer Cox literally just paid a company to go door to door and gather these signatures, right? So very much a pay-to-play game. He spent, I don't remember, hundreds of thousands of dollars, at least 150,000, probably more, on this, perhaps as much as 300,000. I don't have the reports on the top of my head, but I don't have that cash sitting around, okay? And that just gets them onto the direct primary ballot, no matter what the people said at convention. That's a huge problem, right? Pay to play. This poses a significant threat to the party's right to disassociate itself. Isn't that funny? The party's trying to disassociate itself. It's like, ugh, I don't like what the party did. But again, think about the party as an individual. Who is the party? Do you even know at this point? Don't you want accountability? There's someone hiding behind the scenes here in this, right? Okay. So who are we trying to disassociate from? This nominee, right? So the question becomes, why can't we do it? Why can't we just do that? Because he's not the candidate that we the people want. So why does the party behave in a different manner from the people who compose the party? That's a very helpful question. Look for that. Okay. As the rewards for winning the primary extend beyond mere placement on the general election ballot, they include the title of the party's official nominee, right? So not only does the party get to place whoever the party is, the party's candidate onto the general election ballot, but it also gets to put that little monogram, that little R in a circle right next to the name and say, this is the Republican nominee, right? To advise every voter who goes to the general election ballot box that, yeah, this is the Republican guy, right? Even counsel for the Utah Democratic Party admitted during oral argument for Utah Republican Party versus Cox that SB 54 presented a California Democratic Party v. Jones problem because it is the kind of violation of the freedom not to associate that the Supreme Court condemned in Jones. That is to say, in this previous Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court ruled that individuals have the right to disassociate from this whatever choice your party leaders make or whatever, right? So in that case, California enacted a partisan blanket primary in which all voters, regardless of party affiliation, could vote for any party's nominees. That's crazy. Okay. The court held that scheme unconstitutional in part because it created the possibility parties would be saddled with an unwanted, possibly antithetical nominee. So yeah, if you're a member of the Republican Party, how do you feel about Democrats infiltrating your party primary and choosing who the Republican nominee is going to be, or vice versa, right? Really not a fair strategy, and I agree, one that does not uphold freedom of association or disassociation, right? Forcing the party to accept nominees who circumvent the party's chosen nomination method by appealing to members at the fringes of the party accomplishes the same thing. That's a great point. In the state of Utah, the majority of registered voters by a long shot are Republicans, and Democrats typically understand that they really don't stand a chance in state races. And so it's actually become fashionable for people to just nominally switch parties, right? Just be like, oh, I'm going to go ahead and register as a Republican anyway, so that they can influence who the Republican nominee becomes. And that's precisely the kind of thing I saw at the convention. This is the kind of thing that, and this is the kind of thing that we see at the nominating conventions and so on in the caucus system, is that there are some people who have infiltrated the party, and there are more so in a direct election, right? It has saddled the party with a nominee who is antithetical to the integrity of the party and its long-term message. All right, so it has caused this divisiveness problem in the party, right? And we're actually going to find out that party purity arguments are actually unwinnable as long as the party is vested with disproportionate political power. That is to say, anytime a political party has more power than the people who are in the party, then this party purity problem becomes impossible to solve. Because, and I know this from my own experience, because people were berated in the Republican Party for not supporting the nominee, Spencer Cox, right? So how is that when your own party is like, oh, you're the anti-Republicans because you aren't on board with our more, frankly, extreme candidate, right? That we didn't even choose. So you see there's a bait and switch going on there. SB 54 has undermined the very reason for the convention process, accountability. Members no longer feel they are heard, and nominees and representatives are more independent, knowing it is impossible to remove them from their position once elected. So yeah, and that's a great on-cue point with the Spencer Cox thing, because I don't think he feels accountable at all to me, knowing that he can just create his own path to victory regardless of what the delegates do. When their nomination depends on the general electorate rather than the party faithful, it is less likely that party nominees will be equally observant of internal party procedures and equally respectful of party discipline, etc. So that same logic holds here. The faithful delegates are no longer able to hold rogue candidates accountable. The faithful delegates are no longer able to hold rogue candidates accountable. So that does definitely violate our intent as far as our association is concerned. Although the Utah Republican Party's regular direct primary ballot is a closed primary and only registered party members can participate, not all members are the same. As this court has recognized, the act of formal enrollment or public affiliation with the party is merely one element in the continuum of participation in party affairs and need not be, in any sense, the most important. Okay, so this next paragraph is really important because historically the courts in Utah have interpreted SB 54 as not really burdening associational rights very much, based on these 5 reasons. 1, that the law does not regulate the party's internal process, which, like, so the partisan nominating process consists of the caucus convention and the direct primary when that's used. But the state actually administers the direct primary, and it also forces the direct primary in instances like we've seen here. So, like, it's not truthful to say that it doesn't regulate things that pertain to what should be party internal, if you will, right? That's point number 1 that they've asserted in the past. Number 2, the party's continued ability to use traditional advertising channels to endorse the candidate of its choice. I'm sorry, but you really can't compete with, a government printed ballot that has a big R next to a candidate's name that got to show up because he's your nominee, right? That's a huge problem. We're going to revisit that heavily, okay? Number 3, the fact that party members still get to choose the nominee. That's disingenuous because, in theory, yeah, party members do still get to choose the nominee, but we don't get to choose the process by which we choose the nominee. That just violates everything we've already talked about, right? Including our own ability to determine the process, right? Number 4, the state's ability to regulate the scope of party primaries. Like, what's the state doing administering a party primary if the two aren't connected? Like, if you don't ask anything else, ask yourself that. What is a state doing administering a partisan primary if the state and the party are distinct? If the party really doesn't have anything to do with the state doesn't have anything to do with the party, why are they joined at the hip when it comes to the primary? Okay. And number 5, so they've held out that, they've asserted that right, supposedly. Okay. Number 5, the Supreme Court's dicta on the power of states to mandate primaries. So yeah, and the Supreme Court has said in the past, oh yeah, the state can totally mandate a primary. This is a problem. Okay. All right, the majority in Utah Republican Party v. Cox held that SB 54 does not regulate the party's internal process because, in fact, its grand compromise was to maintain the party's traditional caucus system as a path, not the path, by the way, as a path onto the primary ballot. Okay. Oof. Although Section 20A 9407-6 does allow for a candidate nominated under the convention process and proceed to the general election, that is not what happened in the governor's race between petitioner Lyman and respondents Cox and Henderson. So that's a big deal, even though the courts have in the past said, oh, that's okay, you can still use your process, except the process got totally squashed. The process got totally violated. There was an end around, right? So the party has not been able to use the caucus system as its exclusive means of nomination since the passage of Senate Bill 54. And I just want to give like a round of applause to Phil Lyman and his team for raising this issue, because this is a huge issue. We have not been able to get Republican candidates elected ever since SB 54 was passed, because SB 54 forces these direct primaries and turns our red candidates blue. Okay? Huge deal. My representational rights have suffered. Everyone's representational rights have suffered. Okay. Next, like the district courts, argues the party's freedom not to associate with unwanted candidates is sufficiently protected because the party's leadership can publicly disavow signature gathering candidates. Okay. And like, even if that had happened, it still wouldn't have been enough. Because what are you going to do about that big R on the ballot, okay? And anyway, he says, this is completely the opposite of what has happened. The Utah Republican Party officers threaten removal of delegate positions if support is not given to the signature gatherer, who always wins the direct primary, vetoing the delegate nominations. Isn't that uncanny? The signature gatherer, the guy who's pay to play, just happens to be, he has the name recognition and the campaign spending to be able to just secure a victory through the more, the direct primary method, which is a less informed electorate, right? So, and he says this is vetoing the delegate nominations. That this is factual. You can't contest this. Okay, the party's associational rights have clearly been trampled upon, and now delegates question what the point of their position is. There is not much left of the right to associate. So, all the people who showed up to caucus night to vote for their delegates and all the work the delegates put in, the many hours at convention, the many hours, like many hours preceding that they spent vetting these candidates. They'll just flush it down the toilet just because this one guy spent enough, grease enough palms to get enough signatures of, frankly, a very small minority, and then spend his way to the ballot. And this is how this happened. Like, this is how this happened. Is we lost our associational rights because it's more than associational rights that are being discussed. That is to say, the party itself has robbed the people of some of their representational rights. If that were not the case, there'd be no cause for complaint. The people could just be just as well represented without the Republican Party, right? But here's the problem. We'll expand more, okay? In Jones, the ability of the party leadership to endorse a candidate did not lessen the burden on party members' ability to choose their own nominee. So too, the ability to publicly disavow a candidate does not alleviate the forced association imposed on the party here. Candidates who seek the nomination through gathering signatures are listed as the party's candidates in the party's primary ballot and can become the party's nominee in the general election ballot, all in contradiction of the party's express rules. Previous courts' decisions that the ability to publicly deny those candidates is a solution has failed to consider Jones. In fact, tactical considerations have seriously constrained the ability in practice because the denounced candidates, such as respondents Cox and Henderson, have ended up certified as the party's nominee in the general election. Right? So this is just saying there's this irresistible aspect to it, that the fact that they were certified as the party's nominee, you can have all the public disavowals you want, they're still getting their names printed on the government ballot with a big R next to it. So those public disavowals don't count for very much, do they, when they're compared with the ability of the government itself to advertise that nominee, alleged nominee, and that endorsement, right? That's a problem. That is an unequal track to the ballot. The majority in Utah Republican Party v. Cox further suggested, again like the district court, that there can be no severe burden on the party so long as the party's members choose nominees. The majority argued that we must define the association with the requisite specificity and proceed to define the party as a collection of roughly 600,000 registered Republicans. Because SB 54 still permits those party members to choose the nominee, the majority concluded the burden is minimal. And I would just ask, which party members? Which party members chose the nominee? Right? And if you use caucus convention, you get one answer. And if you use a direct primary, you get a different answer. Why is that? It's because the composition of your electorate is significantly different. The decision process is significantly different. The representational power of the people is different. As we've stated throughout this, you get a different kind of nominee. You're getting a blue nominee instead of a red one, all because the state decided we're going to put our thumb on the scale. Okay? So this theory from the previous case presents two key issues. First, it assumes that the transfer of nomination from the party's established convention-based system to a large-scale member vote does not result in any significant changes. However, as demonstrated in the present case, it has been established that nominating procedures are substantive, and dismissing such a change as insignificant has been misguided. Okay, and just to clarify this point here, again, see my other video about indirect versus direct elections. The Founding Fathers themselves intentionally had different offices being elected through different methods, direct and indirect methods. And there's also a legislative method, which is basically even more indirect, right? And so they had these different procedures for a reason. It's because they're designed to get a different kind of candidate. And different kinds of candidates can actually act as a check on each other when they're installed strategically, as the founding fathers intended, into different offices in government. However, you should not have an office in government where you mongrelize these different methods or have a trapdoor like we see right here. That's a problem, okay? So second, this perspective reduces political parties to mere collections of individuals. Okay, get ready for this. Get ready for this. This is big. Failing to recognize that a political party is more than the sum of its members. Political science literature has long observed parties have several components, only one of which is their membership. Consequently, political parties possess associational rights that are distinct from those of their individual members. Okay, so I'm going to pause right here because I wish I'd had conversations with Phil Lyman and his team on this point a lot sooner on this, because remember how I said that we should treat political parties as though they were individual human beings, right? Or collections of people, right? Think people instead of party, right? So try that right here. See if that applies, right? It reduces collections of people to mere collections of people, right? And if we peel back the layers, this is what needs to be argued if this reaches oral argument before the Supreme Court or any legislative body that's contemplating the fiasco created by, or at least highlighted by SB 54, is that it goes beyond the signature gathering route, right? And this is actually why. And I think it's because parties are regarded as having additional rights beyond the remainder of us ordinary human beings. I really want you to think about that. How did that happen? And what does that mean for us? Because again, you remember that argument of party purity. If a Republican didn't get on board with the Spencer Cox nominee, the fake nominee, the blue nominee, the pay-to-play nominee from the party, he's supposedly got the party's endorsement, but he doesn't have my endorsement. He doesn't have the intelligent will of the people behind him. And so how can you transmogrify the will of the people into not the will of the people? The only way you can do that and have it be recognized by the government as such is if the parties themselves have a back door to get special access to the government, to the ballot, right? And so that's the problem, because, like I said, if the members of the Republican Party could just not care about who the Republican nominee is because it doesn't affect the general election ballot, we could just split off and say, well, we're the real grand old party. And we endorse Phil Lyman. And we don't care what those guys think. And we wouldn't have to care what they think because they wouldn't have special access. But this is the point. And Phil Lyman, if you're watching this, this is a point we need to understand, right? Political parties are mere collections of individuals. And the minute that we think that there's something special, that they have First Amendment rights that human beings don't have, that the general electorate doesn't have, that's actually the poison pill that I think we've just gotten used to in our partisan system that we've been under for more than 200 years, right? We've gotten so used to that we think it's true. But what happens here with this consequently line, that's a non sequitur. It does not follow that just because we can say, it's kind of a vague platitude to say that a political party is more than the sum of its members. I could say that about again, the tennis club or my grocery shopping membership group or whatever, or a Bible study group. We could always just rehearse that platitude and say, this group is more than the sum of its members. Abracadabra, sprinkle some political science or whatever on it, some psychology on it, and then you can say, well, and therefore the group has superior rights to those of its individuals. And this, to me, is what really just doesn't add up And yeah, we've just been prone to think this way since forever. But I'll show you what it actually reminds me of. There's this problem. Yeah, so you remember Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And this is the logic that we have, I think, unwittingly adopted with regards to the parties and the partisan system itself. You see, the people who are in the Republican Party and who didn't want to endorse Spencer Cox have a kind of forced Stockholm syndrome because they can't leave the Republican Party. I mean, they could go join the Democrat Party, but then they'll have the same problem. They'll have the exact same problem of their own representational rights being stolen from them in the name of the party. The party confiscates those rights because the party is regarded as having rights that are more equal than those of the people who are in the party. And so this is a point where I'm asking us as members of, whatever political party, or as not members of a political party, to just really think about this. And frankly, this is a great point for us to have compassion for those who aren't affiliated with either of the mainstream parties, because maybe this is one of the reasons why they don't participate, because they recognize that this historic pattern of bait and switch has been happening for centuries. And we've all been politically disenfranchised by the two-party system. And so, yeah, this is the point in the entire petition here, where I'm pausing here for a while because it's really important for us to understand. We cannot move forward and believe that political parties have more rights than the people who are in the party. And if anyone thinks otherwise, I invite you to point me to the First Amendment or whatever. What First Amendment rights does a party have that a person doesn't have? Because here's how endorsements should work. I'm going to describe this to you and compare and contrast it to the current partisan endorsement system. Again, you are a political party. You're the political party. Let's just go ahead and say that you are the Republican Party here, right? And your endorsement is sought. And there are these candidates who are like, hey, endorse me, make me your nominee. And you're like, oh, I don't know, I'll think about it, right? And you think about it and you decide on a candidate that you want to nominate and give your endorsement to. But then here's where some of the magic happens. That nominee ends up being printed onto a government ballot with your endorsement, right? And by the way, this is really important to point out. Any other person, your next door neighbor, also a registered voter, has just as many representational rights under the Constitution as you do, but that person can't do the same thing because that person is not recognized by the government as a political party, or not as a qualified political party, or whatever designation they might try to come up with to try to give some groups of individuals who are supposed to be private parties more rights than others. Do you understand? Right? Do you understand why it's unfair that a political party gets special access to the ballot? This is why party members have been disenfranchised. And it's also one of the reasons why they can't just leave the Republican Party. They're not free to disassociate because their representational rights have been vested in a party where their participation, although voluntary, does in fact give them more clout if they are on the in crowd and can be part of that magical process to determine who the nominee ends up being. But as far as they get a piece of that special pie given to them by the government, then they're one of those animals that's more equal than the rest of us. So we've got these party animals among us. And this is, again, why, Phil Lyman, if we get rid of this, if we get rid of the government's claws out of the parties and make it so that a political party's endorsement, their nominating process, their whatever, is no more politically significant in the general election than, I don't know, a rock star's endorsement, or your local grocery store's endorsement, or any private individual's endorsement, right? If we arrive at that point, then we will actually be free as people to have our representative powers respected and to get the candidates that we want elected. And until that's the case, we are just going to have a revolving door of another kind of SB 54-like triggering condition for the government to come and put its thumb on whatever private party or institution's nominating procedures, because that party, that organization, is actually part of the government. There's this incest going on between the parties and the government. And we need to realize that. We need to realize that that is the poison pill that gave us SB 54. That's how we got the government-mandated direct primary glued onto a supposedly private party's nominating procedure. I just can't emphasize this enough. I want to be able to explain it and articulate it well enough, but I hope that you understand what's going on here. Political parties are just non-governmental organizations. They should be private organizations. And until they're truly private organizations, they will not be able to exercise full freedom of association. Their members will not be fully free to associate or disassociate without penalty when it comes to choosing the people they want to have in office. You wonder why Rob Axson proceeded to certify Spencer Cox and Deidre Henderson as the Republican Party nominees for the governor and lieutenant governor offices? It's because the Republican Party chair is, in fact, a government office. And there is no constitutional provision that grants the party or any part of it any power any more than the rest of us. This is why we are seeing what we are seeing. So, at the end of the day, I do agree that collections of individuals have First Amendment rights. But this contradicts the previous assertion that the rights of a party, political party, any organization, are inherited as First Amendment rights. No, if we're going to regard them as having any such representational rights in government, they must be coming from a different source than the First Amendment, because this party is not human. And therefore, that's the only way you can argue that it does not have the exact same rights as the people who comprise it. And that's the argument here in this paragraph. And in my opinion, it's I wish I'd caught this earlier. But the structure of the party, comprised of its bylaws, customs, and leadership, also enjoys protection under the First Amendment. This is true. But it's not something more than the First Amendment. I really hope you understand what I'm saying. And even if I just wrap up here, I think this will have covered the bases here well enough to get to this point, okay? I'll go on. There could be other examples that we could give. The reason SB 54 is a thing, the reason why we have this multi-stage nominating process in the party, is because the party is an arm of the government. That's why the people aren't free to choose their own candidates. That's why the candidate we got was a government-sponsored candidate, okay? So SB 54 provided the state ultimate authority, I'm just going on with the brief here, to alter the internal regulations of political parties. And wow, just like, I'm just going to pause here again, because that's true. That's true. SB 54 was kind of the mute button. That's the trapdoor button that the state can use to squash the people's candidates at will, right? SB 54 is that nuke button, right? But that functionality has always existed as long as the two-party system has existed. As long as any political party, in fact, has been regarded as having superior rights to the people themselves. Because the moment they do that, they're a part of the government. So let's reread this claim right here, actually, in that light. Let's understand this. I'm just exploring this here, okay? SB 54 provided the state ultimate authority to alter the internal regulations of an arm of the state's government, which was granted special dispensations of power by the state. You would not see this statement as problematic if that were one of the constitutionally enumerated powers of government, would you? I mean, unless it were in violation of people's rights, which, yeah, you can have constitutional provisions, supposedly, that do indeed violate human rights and civic rights. But that's why this exists. And courts have ruled this to be a minimal burden because the courts have recognized that, I'm just interjecting my own statement here, the courts have recognized that the parties are part of the government. Something to think about. Okay. Courts have ruled this to be a minimal burden so long as the ultimate nomination decisions are left up to the party membership. Okay, and this calls to mind that one Stalin quote, where he's reported to have said something like, I don't care who votes or how, but what I care about is how the votes are counted, or who counts the votes and how. Isn't that what we're seeing here? Like, our own government is gaslighting us by saying, oh, yeah, you get to choose your nominee. You get to choose who's going to be on the ballot. No problem. We're totally hands off here, right? Except they do, have a little hidden switch that when you pick a candidate they don't like, they're going to change the way the votes are counted in a way that drastically alters the outcome. Isn't that cute? Okay. So the courts have ruled this to be a minimal burden. Yeah, okay. So as long as the nomination decisions are left up to party membership. But this court has already rejected that theory. And this is important because the Supreme Court actually does agree that political parties do not have rights that the people don't have, right? We're going to revisit that. We're going to revisit that statement from the very first quote in the opening paragraph on the question presented. But for now, let's keep going. Okay. The court has held that the freedom of association also encompasses a political party's decisions about the identity of and the process for electing its leaders. Yeah, I don't disagree. A political party is free to exist. It's free to select its leaders. It's not free to have special ballot access. Okay? And that a state cannot substitute its judgment for that of the party as to the desirability of a particular internal party structure. Yeah, I'm on board with that. Okay. And that's true. But get the Supreme Court to uphold that. That's what they need to do. Because if they're going to stand by that, then they have to get rid of the disproportionate government power being wielded by parties. All right, contrary to the majority's opinion, Utah Republican Party v. Cox, these are not confined to internal activity. Yes, this is a fact. And Phil Lyman has spotted these Hydra heads poking out from this giant machine because, in fact, they are joined at the hip. Okay? These rights extend to a party's choice of nominee too. This court has already explained that a party's determination of the boundaries of its own association and the structure which best allows it to pursue its political goals is protected by the Constitution. Yep. Provided that those political goals don't include any disproportionate power. In addition to the reasons cited by the majority in Utah Republican Party v. Cox, the Utah District Court argued that Senate Bill 54 does not significantly limit the party's associational rights because it is not obligated to register as a qualified political party. That's cute, right? Getting into that, this means the party can function as an unregistered entity and implement its preferred nomination procedures, with the only drawback being the loss of its endorsements on the ballot. The district court pointed out that the Supreme Court has ruled that the First Amendment does not give political parties a right to have their nominees designated as such on the ballot, leading the district court to conclude that there was little, if any, burden. And okay, minus the little burden thing, but it's true that the First Amendment doesn't give political parties a right to have their nominees designated as such on the ballot. In fact, the First Amendment does not give political parties any right to have their nominees appear any differently than a nonpartisan nominee on the ballot. Okay? Because otherwise, you're saying parties have special rights. You're saying some animals are more equal than others. And the minute the government says, and especially the moment you agree, that there are any animals that should be treated differently, then the government will control those animals because they are its own pets. They are products of incest between supposedly private parties and the government. Okay? All right. I'm going to have more to comment on this with the ballot and how it appears. But okay, the district court, just to go on here, the district court minimized the issue by stating that while there is no constitutional right to have endorsements printed on the ballot, the unconstitutional conditions doctrine holds that the government may not deny a benefit to a person on a basis that infringes on his freedom of speech or association, even if he has no entitlement to that benefit. According to precedent, if the government could deny a benefit to a person because of his constitutionally protected speech or associations, his exercise of those freedoms would in effect be penalized and inhibited. This would allow the government to produce a result which it could not command directly. Okay. While the Utah Republican Party may lack a constitutional right to have its endorsement on the ballot, it's factual, Utah's requirement to change your party rules to accommodate our preferred kinds of nominees or lose your ballot access is unconstitutional. Yeah, that's also true, right? I'm just saying, let's take this to its logical conclusion in everything. I'm going to keep going. This condition is coercive due to the significant electoral disadvantages if the party remains unregistered, failing to mitigate the law's impact on First Amendment rights. And I love this because, I mean, this petition is brilliant in so many ways. It's tearing apart this differential access argument that the Utah courts have upheld, saying, oh yeah, it's totally fine for the government to put its thumb on the scale during your private elections. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not okay for them to steal our representational power through the disguise of a party and swapping out the process without our consent and so on. No, they're not allowed to do that. Okay, and that's a really great point. And yeah, it's because there's a multi-track system. So my proposal is just have a uniform method for ballot access. It's that simple. No separate track for parties. No endorsements appear on the ballot. All right. The arguments from the majority and district court do not refute that SB 54 imposes a heavy burden. Forcing candidates who secured the party's convention nomination is as restrictive as a ban on endorsements or forcing non-members into primaries. As the Supreme Court noted in Jones, SB 54 forces the Republican Party to adulterate its candidate selection process, a political party's basic function. A political party has a First Amendment right to limit its membership as it wishes and to choose the candidate selection process that will, in its view, produce the nominee who best represents its political platform. When their nomination depends on the general electorate rather than on the party faithful, it is less likely that party nominees will be equally observant of internal party procedures and equally respectful party discipline. Okay. The First Amendment rights of political parties to associate with their members, limit their membership, and select candidates in a manner that best represents their political platforms is in danger of becoming extinct for the citizens of Utah. This precarious situation has the potential to influence similar law throughout the country and conflicts with this court's decision of New York State Board of Elections versus Lopez-Torres, where the respondents' contention that New York's electoral system does not assure them a fair chance of prevailing in their party's candidate selection process finds no support in the court's precedents. Utah Supreme Court denied petitioner Lyman's extraordinary writ, creating conflict with this court's statements. In summary, like this is where the persuasive argument takes place to say why should the Supreme Court hear this, right? That the Utah Supreme Court denied petitioner Lyman's extraordinary writ, creating conflict with this court's statements in Torres, which further complicate the legal landscape surrounding the associational rights of a political party and its members. So again, back to the quote from the very beginning of the brief, the question posed. These rights are circumscribed, however, when the state gives the party a role in the election process. And I would just put period right after that, because that statement is true. It's true in itself. And the Supreme Court admits that this statement is true. And if you take this statement to its logical conclusion, the state cannot delegate an electoral process, role, or power to the parties. In other words, political parties wield no more rightful political power than a basketball team or a German Shepherd's fan club or your Costco membership. They don't have any more right to representation than any of you, right? These rights are circumscribed when the state gives the party a role in the election process. The state gave the party a role in the election process by giving the party special access to the ballot. And in return for that special access to the ballot in a quid pro quo, the state arrogates to itself power to manipulate the party's election process, influencing who ends up being the party's nominee. In effect, political parties collude and conspire with the government itself to rob the people of their representative power in government. They're stealing our voice. Are we going to let them get away with it? I hope not. They go on to say, for example, by giving certain parties the right to have their candidates appear with party endorsement on the general election ballot. And as we both know, the right to have their candidates appear on the general election ballot at all, in any manner that is different from the manner available to the citizens at large. And that is precisely what has happened to Phil Lyman. And so I would ask Phil Lyman to strengthen his case and pursue this question as well. Pursue the question of why wasn't he allowed to be on the ballot at all? Why is there this multi-track system for getting onto the ballot? That's unfair. And he knows that it's unfair. Everybody who's been involved in this knows that it's unfair. There shouldn't be a multi-track access to the ballot. Parties, registered parties, qualified political parties, the minute you start creating those designations with special provisions for access, you 100% guarantee that the government will sink its claws into those organizations because they are offering a quid pro quo. They're not offering that political power for nothing. They are assimilating the parties into the government. And in return for that power, they demand the ability to control the parties. That's why Rob Axson, the Utah Republican Party chair, acted the way he did. Okay? And that's why the people were disenfranchised. The people chose a different nominee. Someone other than who they chose ended up on the general election ballot, seemingly with their endorsement. And by the way, even showing up on the ballot, even with a partisan endorsement, would be largely a moot issue if the electorate were as informed as the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has admonished us to be. In June of 2023, the First Presidency issued a statement urging members of the church not to vote a straight party ticket. Okay? So much for endorsements. Okay, this statement quoted in its entirety. Then the state acquires a legitimate governmental interest in ensuring the fairness of the party's nominating process, enabling it to prescribe what the process must be. Okay, and this right here is a poison pill because, again, even though that statement from this court previously affirmed that people's rights are circumscribed when political parties are given a role in the election process, that is unequivocally true. Even though that's true, they've already added an escape hatch. And that escape hatch is saying, well, but if you do allow parties to have their nominees endorsed on the general election ballot, appear there and plus have an endorsement, then the state acquires a legitimate governmental interest. AKA, your party just became part of the government. It's a secret combination. And then it enables the government to prescribe what the process must be. Your party's part of the government. Okay, that's why this is happening. This statement, quoted in its entirety, is consistent with what we said in the Utah Republican Party 2016, Utah 17, and does not support Mr. Lyman's view that a qualified political party's internal rules trump state law. Okay, right? So that was from the Utah, and that's why the Utah Supreme Court quoted that part, because they quoted that they cherry-picked that phrase, and this is what lawyers do, by the way. They will actually stack up mountains of self-contradictory precedent just so they can cherry-pick the parts that they like. I like that part, and we're just going to selectively enforce this part, selectively uphold. That's why case law exists. And I have actually filed a petition very shortly after Phil Lyman did to the United States Supreme Court fighting the notion of binding precedent. Because binding precedent, case law, is just legislating from the bench. It violates the separation of powers. Anyways, you can follow that case when I get time. When I get more time, I'll be publishing more videos on that, okay? All right. So this ruling from the Utah State Supreme Court, this ruling contravenes this court's understanding of a state's power to prescribe party use for primaries or conventions to select nominees for the general election is not without limits, right? What vague wording, though? I mean, of course it's not without limits. Per the United States Supreme Court's own ruling, you can't give political parties any differential political power, okay? To say that a state can require a party or candidate to participate in a direct primary after becoming the nominee through the political party's nominating convention is a far cry from saying that this is not a constitutional violation. To be sure, we have, as described above, permitted states to set their faces against party bosses by requiring party candidate selection through processes more favorable to insurgents, such as primaries. So they've just admitted, brazenly admitted, it results in different candidates being selected, okay? But to say that the state can require this is a far cry from saying that the Constitution demands it. The Utah Republican Party and its nominees, its core associational activity protected by the First Amendment, is being circumvented by the same reasons the New York state legislatures were opposed to the direct primary over 100 years ago, because it leaves the selection of party nominees to voters uninformed about the candidate's qualifications. That's describing a direct primary, per the words of the United States Supreme Court, and places a high premium on the ability to raise money. There we go. SB 54 and direct primaries. Yeah, and this is one reason why in my other election integrity videos, including about direct primaries and SB 54, I specifically call out the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is a part of election insecurity. As long as that exists, government candidates can just spend their way to victory at taxpayer expense, at public expense, and they don't even have to levy an official tax to do it. They can just steal your money, okay? It discourages candidate participation and will eventually stifle delegate participation. Selection by convention has been a traditional means of choosing party nominees, and to suggest that having multiple parties or more unrestricted access to the primary ballot does not automatically justify limiting how a political party can choose its candidates for nomination. The state can, within limits, that is short of violating the party's freedom of association, discourage party monopoly, for example, by refusing to show party endorsement on the election ballot. But the Constitution provides protections of a party's associational rights, and a state has no authority to veto a party's nomination of a candidate through its convention process when the state has allowed for such a process to be part of the primary election system. So again, like, all of these points just become moot if you just don't allow, if you just uphold that first finding, just hold to that first principle and don't forget it. Don't allow political parties to have political power above and beyond the people themselves. That's a really simple principle, really simple to uphold. But then the courts feel like they have to add more stuff, more fluff, and say, but in this case, yeah, it's true that we shouldn't steal people's property, but, anyway, sorry. Okay. The decisions made by the Utah Supreme Court significantly impact the associational rights of parties and their members. Senate Bill 54 squarely imposes a mandatory primary on unwilling political parties. These decisions have strayed so far from the principles of the First Amendment that they threaten to undermine the fundamental right of association to choose a candidate selection process
that will, in its view, produce the nominee who best represents its political platform. This decision allows the state to overreach in setting election law frameworks, heavily burdening the Utah Republican Party, its members, and nominees beyond their capacity. Without this court's review, SB 54 uses state power to force a political party into endorsing a nominee through a direct primary, bypassing the party's internal convention-based nominating procedures the legislators claim to have protected for the Utah Republican Party. Petitioner Lyman achieved the nomination by reaching 60% or more of the delegate votes of the nominating convention, and since has suffered from intrusion by those with adverse political principles. Yep, correctly stated. And by the way, this is one reason why repealing SB 54 would not be enough. It's because there are thresholds for these conventions. And if you get above 60%, as Phil Lyman did, then you can, in theory, avoid a direct primary. But then supposedly SB 54 forces it, and the election law has just become like convoluted, and they're not even applying it correctly, and so on. But in any case, the more complex it becomes, the more little knobs and things there are that they can just fiddle with to force a direct primary. They can still, without SB 54, still force us to have the candidate that they want. It's just SB 54 lowered the bar for them. It made it easier because they could just spend their way. Anyway, so, but still, by having those things like, oh, but you do a direct primary if, it's like, just don't do a direct primary. Just don't. Like, don't turn red elections blue. Just take the red election and say, that's it. I think it's simple. And ultimately, actually, I've covered this a little bit in my other election videos, but we shouldn't even have partisan nominations. You can endorse a candidate as a party. That's fine. And the only effect that should have is that if people follow your party and they want to outsource their thinking to you, then at the ballot, they can go ahead and outsource their thinking, and because they've listened to you and they trust you more than they trust themselves, I guess, right? And that's basically just kind of a self-organized indirect election, if you will. But if it's going to be organized at all in that way, it needs to be self-organized, not organized by the government, not orchestrated by the government, right? You understand? Because otherwise, the government's going to put its thumb on the scale. So, yeah, as far as nominating is concerned, we should just have a single one-and-done election. Boom. Like, what's stopping us from just holding a bona fide indirect election for the governor? That's the way the Constitution originally worked. It said indirect elections for executive branch positions, like President of the United States. That's what the Electoral College was supposed to be, but mostly isn't anymore because that's been corrupted too. More on that in another video. The Utah Republican Party delegate votes were disqualified in the striking display of indifference by the Utah State Supreme Court, turning a blind eye to the urgent pleas for extraordinary relief is improper, and denying Petitioner Lyman's request for relief for reasons based on his view that the Republican Party's internal rules trump Utah's election laws, a claim we rejected there in the previous lawsuit against Spencer Cox. There we held that if a party seeks to be a qualified political party under Utah law, as the Utah Republican Party has, so again, they had this special access track, the party must comply with the state law. So basically, if you want special power, sure, we'll give you special power, but we get to control your process. Direct conspiracy and collusion, okay? Must comply with state law, including the requirement that members be allowed to seek the party's nomination for elective office through signature gathering and or the convention process. In other words, yeah, we'll give you more power as long as you steal it from the people and share it with us. Man, collusion and conspiracy and robbery of the rights of the people in broad daylight. This is exactly what's happening here. Share this far and wide. Make sure people know exactly what's going on here. The government is stealing our electoral power. This is unacceptable. Through the signature gathering and or convention process. For this and other reasons, we deny the petition without calling for a response. Great. The Utah Supreme Court sit on it too. Who's surprised? Forcing a candidate onto the primary ballot after earning the party's nomination by convention votes undermines members' collective associational rights. This interference disrupts the political party's established candidate selection process, stripping members of their fundamental ability to self-govern and choose their representatives. This court has passed decisions that have made clear a significant encroachment upon associational freedom cannot be justified upon a mere showing of legitimate state interest. Even when acting to pursue a legitimate interest, a state cannot adopt means that unnecessarily infringe upon constitutionally protected liberties. So much fluff. Okay. Whew. But, I mean, it's about as clear a statement as you get sometimes. It is constitutional for a state to require some significant modicum of support, which Utah Republican Party demonstrates by its candidates polling 2% or more of the total votes cast for all candidates for the United States House of Representatives in the same regular general election. This qualifies the Utah Republican Party to be able to participate in nominating the registered political party's candidates in accordance with the provision of Section 20A9406, compelling a candidate to a direct primary after winning party nomination at a convention violates the First Amendment, raising doubts about whether the convention is a genuine election or merely symbolic. Utah's election code states that candidates for office that are to be filled at the next regular general election shall be nominated in a regular primary election by direct vote of the people in the manner prescribed by Utah law. Utah Code 20A9431A, Utah's election code further instructs that a candidate who at the regular primary election receives the highest number of votes cast for the office sought by the candidate is nominated for that office by the candidate's registered political party. Despite these provisions, Mr. Lyman argues that the Utah Republican Party's constitution and bylaws require that any candidate who receives 60% or more of the votes at the party's nominating convention proceeds to the general election regardless of the primary election's outcome. This is true. In other words, Mr. Lyman contends that the Republican Party's internal procedures trump state election law. We disagree. And of course they disagree, because they've got their claws in the party. Why are they dictating private party business? Guys, come on. Petitioner Lyman did not contend that the Republican Party's internal procedures trump state law. But even there, what's state law doing dictating private affairs? Petitioner Lyman Extraordinary Writ argues that the decision made by Respondent Henderson to place petitioner and respondents on the direct primary ballot held June 25th, 2024 was in direct conflict of decisions of previous courts and the decisions of the Utah Supreme Court when it certified the meaning of the questions surrounding the member seeking the party's nomination by either or both methods, so forth and blah, 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 blah. Anyways, petitioner argues that Respondent Henderson's decision to force a direct primary despite delegate votes contradicts Section 20A9407.6, which allows for convention-based nomination. The Utah Supreme Court's denial of the petitioner's writ conflicts with its previous rulings and raises constitutional concerns over state control of party nominating processes. Both petitioner Lyman and respondent Cox sought nomination through conventions and signature gathering, with Lyman already nominated at the convention. Thus, a direct primary for governor was unnecessary, as the Utah Republican Party had its nominee. I agree. The Utah Supreme Court has resolved a significant federal question in a manner conflicting with this court's decisions. Petitioner Lyman requests that this court accept the petition for writ of certiorari to review the matter and then remand it back for further proceedings. Dated October 2nd, 2024, respectfully submitted, Phil Lyman, petitioner pro se.